Good afternoon, and welcome. I am Christy Payne, Cumberland Regional Coordinator with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, and we are so pleased to offer this virtual training today and excited you've joined us. We certainly appreciate your support as we have transitioned to a virtual platform for our educational learning events. You will be muted so we do not experience any audio interference. Also, this training will be recorded. Jill Stott, our Northeast Regional Coordinator, will be monitoring the chat box. So please type in any questions you may have in the chat box, not the Q&A box, and please direct all questions to the host. Jill will be reading those questions out loud during the Q&A session for those who may be joining us by phone. We will do our best to get to as many questions answered as time allows. Certificates of participation and NASW CEU certificates will be emailed out to you next week. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation. A special note to all those calling into the training. So if you need a participant or a CEU certificate, please email our Mid-Cumberland Regional Coordinator, Susan Cope, at susan.cope, that's C-O-P-E, at tn.gov with your name and certificate request so we can capture your participation. At this time, I would like to introduce our Executive Director, Richard Kennedy, to share a few words. Richard?
Thank you so much, Christy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Christy said, my name is Richard Kennedy, and I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. Many of you are familiar with the work that we do at the Commission, but for those of you who are not, the Commission is an independent state agency with a primary mission to lead systems improvement for all children and youth through data-driven advocacy, education, and collaboration. We fulfill that vision and mission through a variety of different aspects and programs, one of which are the 9 regional councils and coordinators across the state. I hope many of you are members of the regional councils, and for those of you who are not, hope you reach out to us and learn more about the opportunities that you have in your particular part of the state. Like all of you, we are figuring out how to continue to navigate and provide the best services possible during this unusual time and pandemic. And one of the things that we have learned is that we have had to come up to speed with technology very quickly. And then 2, we are able to reach even more people through virtual platforms than we were in the real life face-to-face platforms and opportunities that we've had in the past. Also know that COVID has impacted all of the work that you do every single day. And I want to take an opportunity to thank each of you for what you're doing. In addition to taking care of yourself and your families, and others that you care about, you're also continuing to prioritize the services and supports that you provide to the most vulnerable among us across the state. So if no one has told you today, I want to be the one to say thank you for continuing to do all of that in incredibly big and small ways. It's my pleasure today to introduce the 2 presenters who will be leading you all through the Building Strong Brains Tennessee Addressing Adverse Childhood Experiences presentation. As you will see throughout this presentation, the information is fascinating, and I think it is so timely given all that we are facing as communities, as a state, and as a country. So our first presenter this morning will be Melissa McGee. Melissa serves as the Director of the Council on Children's Mental Health with the Commission on Children and Youth. And the second presenter will be Jen Drake-Croft, who serves as the Director of Child Being at the Commission as well. You will quickly see how smart these ladies are and how they both have a gift for explaining what could be incredibly complicated information in ways that are very relatable and that even I can understand. So I want to thank all of our regional coordinators for working together to host this opportunity. Hope that you find a great amount of value in the presentation. And at this point, I will turn things over to Melissa.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, all our friends and family and loved ones. We appreciate you being with us, and thanks, Richard, for the kind words. I learned so much of what I do from you guys, so thank you so much. And to Christy and Jill and Susan for facilitating us today, and the rest of the coordinators. They're pretty awesome. If you don't know who they are or what they do, we would love to help you know that. Susan's email is in the chat box, so feel free to email her if you have questions about what our regional councils do. So we're excited that you get to hang out, or we get to hang out with you today, is how I should say that, right? So we're so excited we get to hang out with you today and kind of talk about the importance of early brain development and how life experience really shapes that going forward. So we're going to kind of dive in the deep end of the pool. I always like to say buckle your seatbelts. Because this may be stuff you're already familiar with, and if you're like me, the more you hear it, the better you do with it, or it may be the first time you're being exposed to this information. Either way, or you may be somewhere in the middle. We love to have you here, and we're so thankful you're with us, and you can email any of the email addresses you see in the presentation, in the chat, that are TCCY folks, and we will be happy to help you move forward in your understanding and dissemination of this information. So when I figure out exactly what's going on here, we'll move forward. What we want you to know is that Building Strong Brains Tennessee has a phenomenal mission, and really it boils down to what you see on your screen, that we are just working to change the culture of Tennessee so that our state's overarching philosophy, policies, programs, and practices for children, youth, and young adults utilize the latest brain science to prevent and mitigate the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And we're going to talk more about what adverse childhood experiences are. We abbreviate that ACEs. So you'll hear us use that term a lot, but we really just want to shift everything we do to give our children of Tennessee the best shot at a healthy, strong, sturdy foundation. The cool thing about Building Strong Brains Tennessee is that it was started by Governor Haslam's administration with Deputy Governor Jim Henry back then, really putting some oomph behind it, and it became just what you see in front of you today. It is a public-private partnership. There is a steering group of public-private persons, and it's supported by foundations and in-kind resources. And the coolest, well, one of the cool things is that Governor Haslam moved into our budget of recurring fund support for our Building Strong Brains. And the fact that it's a public-private partnership is really critical for us to shift our culture all across the state, because it's not just about what myself as Melissa McGee can do as a therapist and a TCCY employee. It's really about all of us that come in contact with kids and families across our state, and how even the smallest things that we interact with can make huge differences for the folks in our state. So it's a collective responsibility, and it benefits everyone in our state. And we'll talk more about that in the not too distant future. So what you see here is really the key, and our understanding is that the overarching message from science is very clear. How children develop early in life matters for them and for the rest of us later in life. Healthy child development is the foundation for these four things you see coming up on the pillars: for educational achievement, for economic productivity, for responsible citizenship, and for lifelong health. When we have a strong and sturdy, healthy childhood development, as you see depicted in this image, then we can build those four key pillars so that as those are built, we are building successful parents for the next generation who are going to build healthy child development foundations. And then that's just going to continue to cycle over and over, because what happens is then our communities become stronger and our economy becomes healthier. And so this just isn't like Melissa's opinion, because you could take or leave that at the door depending on how you feel about me. And so that's the key, is this is information that comes from neuroscience, from molecular biology, genetics, behavioral and social science, as well as economic analysis of human capital. That's the cool thing. It's not just about behavioral health. It's about everything. So we know that that healthy development piece in the early years really tells us that kids will be more successful as they become adults. And so important thing is that stronger foundations early create healthier citizens and adults later in life. So the four concepts, core concepts of development that we are going to go over are from something called the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. Now in your free time, because I know you have a lot of it, You can go Google the Harvard Center for the Developing Child if you have not done so yet, but block off some time because you'll go down some rabbit holes that are just cool as I don't know what. But we're going to use 4 of their core concepts of development: brain architecture, serve and return, toxic stress, and resilience. Jen and I are going to walk you through each one of these as we learn more and more about what healthy childhood development looks like, can be, will be, and sets us up for in the future. So one thing I want to remind you of, and Jen should be proud of me, is that if you are listening to this on a recording, so you're not live with us today, but you're listening in the future, you will not be able to see these videos, but the links will be in the chat, I believe. So you can go back and look. But if you're with us today, you should, in a perfect world, have no problem seeing what's about to happen.
And Melissa, they'll also be in the in YouTube. They'll be in the description.
In YouTube, they'll be, there you go. They'll be in the description in YouTube. Perfect. Share file, Jen?
That's right. Go to share and file, and then you'll be able to pick the video.
Okay. It's asking from my computer. That's not really what I wanted to do. I'm sorry, kids, we even practiced this, which is the eternal, let's go back to this, which is the eternal conversation, right? Would it have, when you took presentation things back earlier, Jen, would it have taken that away?
I hope not. Thank you all for dealing with us through our technical difficulties. Can you try sharing multimedia?
I don't have that option.
Okay. When you go down.
Yeah, it's not clickable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like grayed out.
That's the Melissa word. You know what? We got it. We're on it right here.
Perfect.
Tell me if it works. Can you hear it?
Yep.
All right. So that kind of jumps us into our first section around, I think everybody is being able to see that. Our first section around the brain architecture piece. And while that video may be a little bit intimidating for some folks because it's a little sciencey, it's a little more than what all of us may be comfortable with. But what I want you to know is that in our conversation today, we're not asking you to be any of those disciplines we talked about earlier, physicists, neuroscientists, molecular biology. We're trying to keep this on a fairly high level because a lot of this information goes way beyond what my skill set is trained to do and trained to understand. So we're just trying to keep this at a very conversational level to help spread this message across our state. So when we think about brain architecture, what we know is that it supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. Brains are built over time. We start in those earliest years of life, and our simple skills come first. And when those simple skills get a little more sturdy, then they start building more and more complex skills on top of that. And what we also have learned through all of the study that's been done is that the cognitive, emotional, and social skills or capabilities are all intertwined, and they cannot be undone throughout the life course. So it's just like the strands of rope that are woven together to make a really strong rope. These capabilities are woven together to create strong academic and health outcomes. Emotional well-being and social competence provide a really strong foundation for cognitive skill development. So the key is when you hear somebody who says something to the degree of, well, we need to separate academic from social emotional, that's not possible, because think about that skills rope, that they're all so intertwined together, they cannot be pulled apart. And it makes them strongest because they're intertwined together. Emotional well-being and strong social competence provide a stronger foundation for those learning skills, the academic piece, and they are the bricks and mortar that compromise that healthy foundation we saw that image of earlier. So what we know is that brain architecture either develops a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all of the learning, health, and behavior that follow. And a strong foundation in the early years really improves the odds for more positive outcomes later. And just as you would expect, a weaker foundation is going to increase the odds for later life difficulties. So when we think about brain architecture, I mean, what do you think about? And if we were together in a room, this is where I would make you talk back and forth to me, because I'm not good at just talking at myself. But since that's a little bit more difficult, I'll tell you the answer. You're welcome. So when we think about brain architecture and you're building a home, maybe that's what comes to mind. It's architecture. And so if you build a home, what's the first thing that you do? You lay the foundation. If you have ever purchased a home or built a home, had an inspection, and something came back that said, hey, I think we might have an issue with the foundation, more than likely your response is going to be, I'm going to thank you, but no thank you, right? Because what you know is, especially in an actual home, broken, less sturdy, less secure foundation is going to have issues ongoing, probably for the life of that house. And so when we think about that, let's also think about the earliest years of life, because just like building a home, the earliest years of life build the foundation for all future brain development. If the foundation is laid poorly, then we may see symptoms like addiction, disease, academic problems come out in development later in life. Also, in the construction of a home, once you get that foundation laid, everything happens, and including the foundation, everything happens in an order, a predictable order, because certain things have to be done in order for the next thing to be able to be done. And so that building process happens in a predictable sequence from bottom to top. That is also the same with our brain, just like we talked about earlier. We start with those simple skills and we build on the higher level skills as we go forward. And it requires multiple individuals to do that, just like it does in building a house. It requires all sorts of folks. And I am not the best at knowing what those folks are, but electricians, carpenters, concrete layers, just all those people, bricklayers, all those people have to come together, plumbers, to make sure that house happens in the right way. So when we think about setting up a solid construction of a child's brain, it really depends on the relationships with early child care providers, access to medical professionals, and all of the other adults, in addition to parents that come in and out of that child's life. Whether you're a volunteer at the library or the community center, or a volunteer teacher at a church on Sundays or Wednesdays or Saturdays or whenever you may meet with your faith group. we matter too, because we come in contact with kids and their families, because that strong foundation early is going to set kids up for the probability of more positive outcomes later in life. We know that getting things right the first time is much easier than trying to fix them later. So when we start thinking about what builds brain architecture, well, that's a great question. And we think about kids, and as they're getting a little older, you think about how much rest they need. Man, they can be going 90 miles an hour, and most kids, when they're down for the nap or the sleep, they're down. And most kids need a nap here and there. So we want to make sure that we emphasize those first few years of life, because as you see in this slide, more than 1 million new neural connections happen every second. So this kind of guides us out through newborn, 6 months, and 2 years, and you can see how that activity just proliferates over and over and gets more and more and more, that by the time that we're at 2 years, there is a whole lot going on in that kid, right, in their brain development. And so every second counts when we think about the brain development of a child. That child is born ready to learn, ready for experiences to create and influence those neural connections that you see happening right there. And so by the time a child is 3 years old, 85% of their brain volume is there. Don't hear smarts or intelligence, hear literally volume, like size. That there is so much going on and so much happening that 85% of what their brain will be by the time they're an adult is already in place. That tells you how much is going on. Those early years are so key for establishing healthy neural connections, but we can establish new connections going on through life. So as you see, when we get to about 2 years, 3 years old, there's a lot happening. So your brain really isn't set to keep up with this much happening all the time. So it begins to go through a process that is called pruning. The developing brain will put an emphasis on the experiences it's going through that are repetitive. So let's think hungry. Like if a child, when it gets hungry, they're going to start learning those signs and knowing they need to eat or asking for a snack or something to that effect. So that's one that could happen over and over. In an effort for the brain to be able to speed up transmissions, it's going to prune out the ones that you don't use as much. So maybe they don't need to run from a spider 12 times a day, but they know they need to run from a spider sometimes. So it'll start pruning out those connections that are used less frequently so that the other connections can happen faster, because they might need them in more of a knee-jerk kind of reaction. So it helps ensure that neural connections that are the most frequently used are maintained. It's that whole use it or lose it type thing. But this can be a tricky situation or a double-edged sword, because what if the connections, the experiences that are happening the most often, that are needed the most repetitively, are ones that are not good or positive or healthy for brain development? Sometimes younger children incorporate experiences that are abusive to them or neglectful. And those are the things that their brain holds onto, because they need to be able to know how to navigate those situations pretty frequently. So that's why we're so set on getting this message out about how much early life matters and having that healthy development, because we don't want the healthy stuff to be what is pruned away. And these influences begin very early in life, even prenatally, as you can see here in this slide. So this is a really cool slide. I like this one a lot, because it's talking about how our neural circuits, remember we built all those we're building tons of neural connections in that last slide. And then what we see here is a shift more to how the neural circuits are wired, and they start from that bottom up. And what this graph shows is just kind of conceptual, but what this graph shows is that how different sets of skills develop at different times in the brain. So remember, we start simpler and we build to more complex. We build on the basic, circuits build on circuits, and skills produce skills. And so note that even in the prenatal period, which on this slide is that those negative numbers to the left, even in the prenatal period and the first year of life are more extended in here so that we can see how much growth happens during this time frame. Notice how quickly those neural connections are happening and engaging and creating new, and then it's followed by a drop-off. That's the natural process. That is the pruning process. It's building, 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 and then your brain's like, ooh, we got to figure out what's important, and it starts pruning some things away. So when we think about things like self-regulation, which is a person's ability to control our emotions and behavior, which granted, none of us are 100% effective at that all the time, but somewhere we have learned how to do that. So we think about children and learning self-regulation. It is one of the last skills to finish developing. So although this skill, and I think that's the purple line on here, as this skill starts developing even prenatally, and it takes longer for it to get to its full development, it continues to develop into the late teens and mid-20s. And that helps us understand why children, youth, and young adults still and often need those adult models, adult support to develop skills that help them keep moving forward. It's critical to think about these type things when we look at our public investments, the timing of our public investments. The brain is doing the most formative building it can do, and even pruning out things at a very young age, even before school begins. So it's critical for those circuits to be built at every stage, to be used well, and to be used frequently to build that strong foundation for the harder stuff that comes later. So as we move forward, you're like, well, that's really cool, Melissa. I love that brain architecture piece, and it kind of makes sense with all that building the house stuff, and that's just really cool. But how do we build brain architecture? And I'm super glad that you asked that question. So the way that we build brain architecture is through what the Harvard Center for the Developing Child calls serve and return relationship. We know that genes and experiences shape the developing brain, and we know that that serve and return interaction, just like you think about it, are key. So we're going to go back to a video and watch a little bit about serve and return. Here we go. All right, so that kind of gives us a jumping off space. Get everything turned back on. A jumping off space for talking more about serve and return. So when I say serve and return, you may think of things like volleyball or tennis or ping pong, and that's exactly what we want you to think. It's that back and forth. The key to serve and return is that the infant or the child serves to an adult, and we return that serve to them. And then it's that back and forth piece. So when an infant or a young child babbles, gestures, or they cry, and an adult responds in any way, words, a hug, feeding, whatever, this strengthens the child's brain. They support the development of the communication piece and the social skills. And just like a game of tennis or volleyball, that back and forth can be fun if you're talking to little Johnny about his trip to the supermarket and how much he likes apples and how they put bananas in a bowl so that he can have a banana when he's shopping with his mom or his dad or his granny or his grandpa or whomever. And so that's the key. When caregivers are sensitive and responsive to that young child's signals and their needs, then that environment becomes a rich piece of development for that child. Let's see. So here what we see is what we call the attachment cycle. And in thinking about how babies communicate, really at very small children, infants, they don't have all the words to communicate effectively, so they cry, right? The baby has a need, it cries, the need is met by a caregiver, and so because that need is met by the caregiver, the baby's like, okay, cool, all right. So the next time they cry, I have a need, and then they cry, they're like, oh yeah, that need's going to be met by that caregiver, and then trust develops even more, and so we get into this cycle, and that's where healthy development is formed and built upon. It even starts in the womb when an expectant mother takes care of herself physically. She's able to avoid chronic stress situations and stay away from harmful toxins that may not be great for the brain development of the child. When we bring that child home, they are basically aliens to this world. They're like, whoa, dude, I had everything going for me, and this just didn't working out for me right now. So they came from an environment where everything was working. It was warm. They were constantly fed. They heard the sounds of mom's heartbeat. They may have heard music that was being played. So just, that's the key, is they're out and they're serving to us because they now have a need, and that's how a baby knows how. So when we return, when we meet that need, I always like to say, you mamas and daddies and caregivers and aunties and uncles and grandparents, you all know the difference between a hungry cry and a poopy cry and a ticked off cry, and immediately you can be like, oh, she's hungry. And I don't have children, so I'm fascinated by that. I'm like, I don't know how you can differentiate, but you know this stuff, right? Because you're attentive, you've paid attention, you've met that need before, and you figured it out. And so that is key, and that is the key to developing trust and safety and love that is needed by these children. So when a caregiver, a baby's hungry, they cry. When a caregiver feeds or gets ready to feed the child, they talk to the child and say, oh, you are hungry. Do you want peas today? Do you want carrots today? Then that is forming attachment and securing attachment. They're learning that their needs can be met, will be met, and this cycle just repeats over and over, day after day. And as the child continues to grow, they are better able to articulate and express their needs in a way that is healthy and can have their needs met. The tricky part really comes when there's an insecure attachment or trauma cycle. So the baby has a need, the baby cries, and for whatever reason, and there could be multiple, that need is not met by their caregiver. And so therefore, a mistrust develops. So when the secure attachment cycle is not available to an infant, it can have lasting effects. If a child expresses that need and that need does not receive a response, the child is not calmed. It is not eased, and it's unable to regulate him or herself because they haven't learned that self-regulation piece. Because remember, we talked about a couple of slides ago, self-regulation starts in infancy, but it's really the last thing that is fully developed. So an infant, small child definitely doesn't have those skills yet. So with a repeated or even intermittent lack of response, will eventually lead to that child making the best attempts they can to self-regulate. So when you're sitting in front of a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old who has had insecure attachment, intermittent attachment throughout their childhood, and you can't understand why they're smoking, I'm going to call it a joint because I'm old and I don't know what it's called now, but while they're smoking a joint to calm themselves down after they skipped school because they knew they were going to get in trouble from their parents when they got called to the principal's office, and you're like, dude, you're 12. Why are you doing this? Well, because it's what that child has learned chills them out, and it worked. So they're going to keep doing it. So sometimes they just keep trying to do the best they can to self-regulate, but still they're going to be anxious. They're not going to know if their needs are being met, and that can continue throughout development. So when a child is in this intermittent or insecure cycle, they may have difficulty responding appropriately when an adult does attempt to intervene. So if little Johnny's out here smoking his joint on the corner and the coolest teacher in the school comes out and is like, hey, little Johnny, man, what's going on? And little Johnny just breaks down, cusses that teacher out, and heads off for the next block, it's nothing to do with that teacher. It's the inability and the lack of development of the self-regulation piece that has disrupted little Johnny's brain development. And so he hasn't been able to move into those higher skill sets in his brain development. And so just because some kids don't always remember all the negative things that happened to them back in the day when they were younger, doesn't mean their brain doesn't, their genetics don't remember. The brain and the body do remember traumatic interactions because of the way our development works. Oh, I love this video. So I'm super excited we get to watch this. All right. So I love that video because it's just so clear how much that child has attached to that parent caregiver person. And so the key is that the video really demonstrates how much small children depend on that back and forth. Like if you watched my face, watch that video, my face reflects the baby's face. Like I'm tense and upset when the mom isn't responding. And that mom or caregiver was kind of a rock star because when she was like still, she was completely still. And so the interesting thing is to watch how the baby became so distressed encountering the still face of the mom. That mom wasn't yelling. She wasn't arguing. She didn't leave. She wasn't physically threatening the child. She simply did not respond. Children are hardwired for that response. I always talk about, I think it's a Geico commercial where that dad is walking through the living room and he has like one kid on each leg and he's like, ooh, that's the serve and return. They're begging for our interaction and they are hardwired for that relationship. And kids become distressed when that relationship isn't working. So the key, too, that we want to make sure we point out in this video is that it's clear that this child has a healthy attachment with that mom, because the minute the mom turns back and, is interacting with the child, man, red eyes, tears, but she's smiling again, right? So that's just I'm a visual learner. That's why I love that. That's just a very helpful video to show us kind of what we're talking about when we talk about that serve and return piece. As we get to this next slide, we want to start thinking about how the intergenerational transmission of early adversity really happens. And when we say intergenerational, what we mean is that it goes from one generation to the next, because we know that when someone experiences early adversity, it leads to a dysregulated stress response. And when their stress response isn't working or is impaired, then that significantly increases their risk for using unhealthy or damaging behaviors to manage their stress. Therefore, their risk for things like addiction or mental health issues goes up a lot higher. And so when they start using those type things to manage their stress, and then they become parents, then it impairs their ability to have a healthy serve and return relationship with their child. That it's intermittent, it's insecure, or it's just absent. And so when they're not able to do that for their child, the potential for their stress related to their child to go up is way higher, because they're not able to deal with their child. So now they have high parenting related stress. So then they're going back to those behaviors that weren't good for them in the first place to manage. And then it causes them to turn away from their infant again. That can lead into parental neglect or abuse. And then we just start that cycle over as those children become parents. So in serve and return interactions, this is just kind of summary. It happens when the young children reach out for us through babbling, through facial expressions. I always like to say young mamas, I got to say this correctly. Mamas with young babies don't wear a lot of big earrings or necklaces, or maybe they even cut their hair off, because children are just reaching constantly, right? They're reaching for the sparkly earrings or the necklace. They're reaching to pull your hair. And so they're naturally seeking that interaction through all sorts of behaviors. And so then we get in sync with a child. We kind of know what's going on. We gesture back to them, and it just continues back and forth, just like that game of tennis or volleyball or ping pong. Serve and return works the best when it is within a trusting relationship between a child and adult who responds to that child's unique needs. Those adults know what it is for that child, and they're able to meet. And those interactions are mutually rewarding and essential for the development of a healthy brain circuits, and increasing their ability to gain more complex skills. So we know that the most important relationships begin in the family. We know that that's true. But also true is the fact that other adult relationships play important roles in the lives of young children, like grandparents, providers of early care and early education, church members, community center members, neighbors. They all play such an important role, and they continue to play this role throughout childhood in building resiliency through adolescence and into adulthood. So this is a really cool chart from a study done a long time ago in 1990, but it's still relevant today. And so in the graph, what you see is 3 lines that depict different trajectories of vocabulary gains. So as you see on the left, I think that's the y-axis. As the left, it says vocabulary words, so 200, 400, 600, and 800. And then on the x-axis below, that's the child's age in months. So they started looking at children around a year old, and most of those children had the same number of vocabulary words available to them. And then they took it all the way out to like 26 months of age. And so if we look at the difference in the 3 lines, the color codes tell us how the study categorized the level of a mother's speech with that child. They didn't look at papas or grandpapas or anything, just a mother for whatever reason. So we look at kind of that purple bluish line on the top, and that's a high level of mother's speech. And you see from 12 to about 26 months, their speech vocabulary went up to almost 800 words. While the green line is kids who had a mother with a low level of speech interaction, it really stayed right around 200 words by the time they were 26 months. And so our brains kind of start to think, hey, what's going on here? Why isn't green line mom talking as much as blue or purple line mom? And so those are great questions, but we want to challenge you to not just think in the standard way that we have probably been taught to think. And so what if the lady or the mom with the bluish purple line, what if that's someone who is a hairstylist? What if that's someone who, I don't know about yours, but mine, I just got to go in the recent week, and mine and we talk nonstop while they're there. She knows everything about my life. She knows the ups and downs, the goods and bads. She knows it, and I know most of her life too. So hairstylists talk a lot. So what if that mom is used to chatting all day? They go pick up the kid from wherever, and they get in the car, and then they're just steadily chatting. Hey, Billy Bob, what's going on? How you doing? Just consistently talking about their day. But then we've got the mom who represents the green low level of speech, and maybe that mom is a dental hygienist who she works in people's mouths all day long, and she's used to not being able to talk because she can't get a response, right? So she just doesn't talk a whole lot. And so she gets in the car, picks up her child, and she doesn't have a lot to say because it's just not how she functions. She doesn't do a lot of conversation. So does that mean she's neglectful of her child? No, not at all. What if the green line mom is a mom who works 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, and she literally sees her child before they go to bed? So those are the things we want to challenge you with. There are opportunities to help educate around the importance of that serve and return interaction, even through vocabulary. And so right from the start of life, what is this is telling us is that experiences matter, and they shape the developing brain from the beginning. And as you can see here, the number of words that kids learn and the rate at which they learn them is strongly influenced by the words that they hear on a regular basis. And so as we will learn, children with larger vocabularies are also developing strong brain pathways that they will have for the rest of their life around reading and speaking, and then that will put them on a road towards doing well in school and then better in life. And so think about the environmental factors that can affect the people in your life who have small children. Even if the parent or parents are unavailable to a child all day, what other avenues does that child have to have interaction with other adults in their life? Are you part of that? Can you, talk to them when they're walking by your house? I live in townhouses, and in quarantine, we've all gotten to know each other better because everybody's home. And so, just even having that kind of interaction is very helpful. I love this too, because like I said, I'm a visual person, and so it kind of helps me put in perspective kind of how our brain's ability to change starts out really high. We kind of refer to that as plasticity, or the ability for the brain to change, to reorganize and adapt. It's greatest in those first years of life, as you can see here in the chart with that aqua blue sort of line. It illustrates that core developmental concepts. It does not reflect like precise measurement for sure. But as the maturing brain becomes more specialized to assume more complex functions, it is less capable of reorganizing and adapting. So for example, by the first year, the parts of the brain that differentiate vocal sounds are becoming specialized to the language that the baby has been exposed to, and they're already starting to lose the ability to recognize sound distinctions in other languages. So that's why if you grew up in a multilingual home, that you may learn languages better than, say, me, who grew up in an English-only home, because I want everything to fit in how the English language sounds and functions. Whereas that's not exactly how it works, right? And so for me to learn a new language like Spanish, which would be awesome, I'm going to have to spend some really quality time with Rosetta Stone or something similar, because it's going to take me a lot longer, because my brain development is wired around English. Where if you have been wired around multiple languages, you have, I believe I'm saying this correctly, more flexibility to continue to learn other languages. I got to travel to Israel it's probably been a while ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, and our guide in Israel had 5 languages mastered, and he was, semi-fluent in 2 or 3 others. And I was just sat there the whole time and was so jealous, because I can't even fathom what it would take for me to come close to that. And so it was cool how his brain had been able to kind of adapt that. So when our brain's ability to change, or the plasticity, starts to decline, as you see in this chart, it means it is easier and more effective to influence a baby's developing brain architecture early in life than it is to try and change it later in life. It's going to take more effort, and it's going to take more resources and to change later on. And so the really good thing is I've always worked with teenagers and their families in my counseling life. And I used to get a lot of people that would say, I don't know how you work with teenagers. And I think it's partially this, that in adolescence, we get an opportunity. It's a bump in plasticity where we can get more for our bang for our buck in that season during adolescence. So it starts to decline, then we get a little bump in plasticity, and then it continues to go on down as they get older. And so I really enjoy that opportunity to help kids figure out what road they're on, and if that's a good road for them, and just kind of figuring out kind of what's next. But that's information about the brain's ability to change. So let's think about, since we talked about adolescence, let's think about adolescent brain development, because we've talked really big about early brain development, how important that is, and we don't want to just, leave you hanging that, well, if it's not fixed early, it's just too bad, because that is not true. Remember, we can make changes all the way through the lifespan. What's different is the time and the effort it takes to do those changes. So that marked window of opportunity in adolescence to change the brain, to influence the brain, and to build resilience during puberty and adolescence is key. So these 3 things are what happens during that time. Like just as in a baby, the adolescent brain overproduces neurons or brain cells and connections between the brain cells. So you got a lot more activity going on in certain areas of the brain. So in particular, growth takes place in that prefrontal cortex, and that sits just behind your forehead, and that's what controls planning and working memory and organization. And so it helps to modulate our mood as well. All of these things contribute to what we call executive function, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, or what we like to refer to as the air traffic control system. So 2 activities that the brain undergoes again during this time, this increased time of development or brain neural development, is pruning and an increase in the myelin, which is a sheath around the brain that forms like an insulating and protective coat around the nerve fibers so that connections can happen quicker and they can be more coordinated and it can take less effort. So some pruning begins early, but it reaches its peak during that remodeling period that we see here in adolescence. And so another region of the brain that grows during adolescence is what we call that corpus callosum. And so it's a fiber system that relays information between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. So when it's linking these different areas of the brain together, that's called integration, and it can result in decreased impulsivity and improved judgment and better self-regulation skills. So our three remodeling kind of project things during adolescence is that air traffic control, where we see that there's so much happening and things are starting to really happen, that use it or lose it, where and pruning really gets at its height during this time, and then the integration of our right and our left brains so that we have better self-regulation and decreased impulsivity and just better coordination between those two things. So we're going to build strong brain architecture through serve and return relationships. So if serve and return builds brain architecture, you're probably like, something's got to not do good for brain architecture. You'd be right. So we are going to look at something called toxic stress. All right. Get us back to our PowerPoint. Turn my video. All right. So as we start to think about toxic stress, you may hear that word and our brains all kind of go to that word like toxic. Oh, that just sounds awful. And yeah, it should sound awful, which I don't like the word should, but it does sound awful, right? And so we are talking about stress that is so high, it actually becomes toxic to our body. When we get stressed, things like our heart rate go up, our blood pressure goes up, our serum glucose, which is your blood sugar, that goes up. And then all these stress hormones start to be released for what we call that fight or flight response. And so when all of these things are happening at the same time, it can overwhelm our body. We're not set to do that. And so it can overwhelm our body and we may not even know it's happening. And so we want to talk through 3 different kinds of stress and why those are important for us to understand. And what I'm going to be doing is toggling back and forth between these 2 things next two slides, between these next two slides so that we can kind of see both sides of it here. So what we do know is that there's a lot of different types of stress, right? Not all stress is toxic. Some stress can be positive for children, and it'll help them prepare for some of the later life stuff. So when we think about positive stress, those are events that are short. They might be stressful. It might be things like the first day of school or going to get your shots as a kid or just, those type events. They are healthy for the brain development and they prepare a child's brain and body for stressful situations later in life. So when we think about positive stress and you're thinking about dropping your kid off at school and you're freaking out, but the kid isn't able to see that, you're freaking out on the inside, they're having a little bit of a meltdown on the outside, and you get to school and you drop them off and teacher says, I got this, and then 30 minutes later you log on and you see, little Johnny playing and having a great time. That's positive stressors. And if we think about, let me get to the right, if we think about kind of what that looks like when our body releases stress hormones, is this graph on the left. Positive stress, normal, essential part of our development. And so you see that there are things like cortisol, which you've probably heard a ton about, also is a stress hormone. When we get stressed, things like cortisol shoot up. And so our body is like, oh, whoa, something's going on. But immediately, because that teacher was there to take that child into the classroom and welcome them in, that stressor ends. Or if you're at the doctor's office getting a shot and the child is just not having any of it, right? And as soon as that shot is over, tears running down their face, and the first thing they ask is, when can we go get ice cream? Because that's what you promised if they did this shot thing, right? That stressor, as you can see, those stress hormone levels go down almost back to normal almost immediately. So that's one of the important things to understand about positive stress, is that it happens, it's short, and as soon as the event is over, man, things are going back to normal. And there is, that healthy, supportive adult there. So when we think about the next level of stress, tolerable stress, those are the things I like to say that none of us really want to happen, but they're going to. They're unavoidable events, they're tragic, and they happen like the loss of a loved one or a pet, or even potentially like moving to a new place. Those can be tolerable stress events. And as we see in our stress response, your cortisol, your stress hormones, they increase, their production increases. And when that event is over, it's not like the positive stressors that once the event is over, it's gone. But with safe, stable, healthy, caring adults, managing that tolerable stress is able to bring a kid closer back to normal. It's a more severe, but it's a longer response, even though it's still limited in duration. So because of that safe, stable, nurturing adult, that child is able to actually model after the adult who's handling that stressor. And the key here is those caregivers that can buffer that stress response. It keeps the events from doing lasting harm to the child. The tricky thing comes is when we get to this toxic stress place that you see here on the right. Toxic stress, the thing that you need to understand about toxic stress, not to tell you what you need to do or anything, but the thing that you need to understand about toxic stress is that it is ongoing, repeated exposure to significant, or any really, but significant adversity. Things like abuse, neglect, or what we call household dysfunction. It is bad for brain development. It does not help us. If there are no supportive adults available to buffer stressful situations, stress becomes toxic, stress chemicals shoot up, and they stay up the whole time that this stressor is going on. So it results in an increased vulnerability to physical and mental health problems that can last throughout the lifespan. And so our bodies aren't built to live in a constant, ongoing state of stress. I always like to say, if you have been trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TCCY, then you learned about the alarm clock and how that alarm clock goes off and makes a lot of noise, and that's how we kind of know that there's something stressful going on and we should probably address it. But the trick is, in toxic stressor, there is no safe, stable, nurturing adult to buffer the stress, so that kid doesn't realize that an alarm clock is going on. It's just what has always been. So when you see kids who grow up in poverty, which is something Jen will talk about later, some of the newer ACEs, who grow up in poverty, who have been in bullying, who grow up in lower income neighborhoods, they have been exposed to adversity so early in life, in a lot of instances, that their life literally is one constant alarm clock. So when you're telling them something isn't okay, they're like, well, it's fine for my mom. It'll be fine for me. It just, I don't know if that's helping or not, but that's what we want to make sure you understand, is that a lot of times people don't, quote, understand the difference, or don't they know that that's not right? No, they don't, because their exposure has been to toxic stress situations their entire life, and maybe for generations. So that's why it's so key. Tolerable stress becomes toxic stress when there is no safe, stable, nurturing adult as well. So thinking through these things is helpful for us to, as we start to think about the kids that we work with, even the families. If you work with adults, this is great information, because a lot of times we think adults should know better, and they just don't, because they haven't been exposed to those sorts of things. So it's helpful for us to recall that. When we look at like common sources of toxic stress, this graph really just emphasizes that children are more frequently exposed to conditions that set the stage for neglect. And it's true worldwide. It's the greatest stress. Neglect is the greatest stressor faced by children. So things like postpartum depression or parental substance abuse often significantly impair serve and return interactions, and that can increase toxic stress situations. So I think what I like to tell you in this slide is that, you know, I was kind of trained to think about abuse, and honestly, neglect didn't get enough of my attention in my education, because we know that neglect can be equally as neurotoxic to brain development as abuse can. So when you're looking at this slide, the green children on the left that have maltreatment as the label, what you see is the maltreatment rates in this graph. So out of U.S. children ages 2 to 5, per 1,000, 75 were considered in a situation with maltreatment, which includes neglect, physical abuse, sexual assault, psychological abuse, and parental custodial interference. It does not include spanking or corporal punishment, and it does not include many of the conditions that lead to neglect. So as you can see, even though the prevalence of maltreatment is high, it is not nearly as high as the number of children who are living with a parent with postpartum depression or a parent that is abusing substances. And so the great deal of opportunity there for us is to help improve the safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments for children. And these data sets come from 3 different sources, and we can get that for you if you would like. But building the capacity of adult caregivers can help strengthen the environment and relationships essential to children's lifelong health, learning, and behavior. And so when we look at this, that's really what we want you to understand, is that when that serve and return breaks down between caregivers and their children, it can be the result of so many factors. Adults might not engage in serve and return due to significant stresses, maybe because they have financial problems and they literally can't see good in the future, or maybe they're not the greatest social connecting person, or maybe they have health problems. How can we help support families that are facing any type of this, who are at highest risk of not being able to provide healthy, strong developments? How can we help support? And so looking at our policies and our programs that address the needs of adult caregivers and help them engage in serve and return interactions will also help support our kids as they develop. You know me and my visual stuff. I love this slide too, guys. It's just really a great, we don't want you to dive too deep in dissecting this. We just want you to kind of see it for what it is. And we're looking at a healthy brain and a neglected brain, and how toxic stress really can have devastating effects. Because when those stress hormones and stress chemicals are released at increasing levels, there is physical consequences for the developing brain. So some of you might be like me and old enough to remember in Eastern Europe when orphanages, like in Romania, so the brain on the left is a young boy from an orphanage in Romania, were overrun with kids. They did not have enough caregivers in the orphanages. It was just harsh conditions. It was just really, really tough. And so institutions were understaffed, abuse and neglect were a reality in everyday life. So what you see here, excuse me, is a PET scan, and a PET scan measures the activity in the brain, and that's going to be reflected in the colors that you see here. And so the slideshow really, this slide really gives us the physical effects of a typically developing 3-year-old on the left versus a 3-year-old that has been in one of these Romanian orphanages since shortly after their birth. And so it provides a picture of the activity in their temporal lobes, reflecting the ways in which early childhood experiences affect the wiring of circuits in the brain. So the picture on your left, typically developing 3-year-old, lots of red, yellow, green. What that tells us is there's high brain circuitry and activity. So remember when we talked about all those neurons connecting to each other, all those neural connections, neurons are going across synapses and they're just all coming together? That's what we're talking about here. The picture on the right, you'll notice immediately, and probably already have, has much less red, green, and yellow, and more black and blue colors. What that shows us is there's not as much neural activity in those temporal lobes where emotions are regulated and where we receive input from our senses. So these children, from what we understand, had such minimal serve and return interactions with adults that they literally were propped up and their bottle was propped up, and they drank, with a propped bottle, and they didn't have any interaction in that. And so the good news is that early intervention can build early brain development, healthy brain development from birth can build a brain on the left. When we identify a child like the child on the right, intervention can help. Early intervention can address and reverse these effects. As the child gets older, it's just going to take more resources and more effort, but we can help that child. So just know that that is what we want you to take from these. And so since we're talking about the brain, let's move on to how toxic stress really alters our brain development. Let's talk about why. Because our brain, you know this, is a complex organ and many factors influence its development. So there's a limbic system, and it's located in the inner brain, kind of beneath the cortex, which is what you see over the top. It's a collection of very small structures, and what those structures do is they are involved in the emotional and stress responses as well as our reward-seeking behavior. The limbic system really is primarily responsible for and associated with instinctive behaviors. So when we start thinking about the limbic system, we think about the amygdala, and you won't be tested on this later, just want you to have this information. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure, and this is our alarm clock. Remember how we talked about that earlier? So it acts like an alarm clock for your brain. When you confront a stressor, regardless of how big or how small, your amygdala interprets it, evaluates it, and sounds off when it perceives danger. It signals the stress response in the body. I used to tell the kids that I worked with, teenagers, I call everybody kids, that it's like those metal alarm clocks that are round and they have 2 metal bells on top and a metal clanger in the middle, and that sucker could wake up next week, It is so loud. And so that thing goes off, and that's what signals the stress response in your body. And so when the amygdala identifies a danger and triggers the stress response system, then our hippocampus engages and assigns memory formation and what we call spatial learning to the event. So that's why you may work with teenagers who have had adversity and you have a great relationship with them, or maybe you don't even know them. They're just somebody in your school or in your building that comes and sees a different therapist or a physician or whomever it may be. And all of a sudden they walk by you and they just start cussing you out. And you're like, oh, dude, I don't even know your name, but okay. Because something in their hippocampus that has assigned a memory and a mood to an event that was potentially harmful for them was triggered by you. Maybe it's like for me, maybe it's my brown hair. Sometimes it's straight, sometimes it's curly. Maybe some white middle-aged woman with curly brown hair harmed a child. And the minute they see me, that's all they see is white, middle-aged, curly brown hair. And so that's one of the important things is when your amygdala signifies that stress response, then your hippocampus starts to engage and assign mood and memory to that. And so that's one of the keys. Also involved is what's called the hypothalamus, and it's the control center for our stress response system in our body, and it's the one that regulates the release of the stress hormones, including things like cortisol. And so they all work together, and the limbic system functions to provide a foundation for continued learning and development. And so when the limbic system is functioning well, it allows a child to further engage in higher level cognitive skills over and over. When this system is disrupted by toxic stress events, the brain isn't able to form those important neural connections to keep going up the ladder. Therefore, they kind of get stuck in the neural connections where they are. They can't get to those higher cognitive skills, so they remain in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. They consistently live in that alarm going off all the time. And that stress response system is just shooting stress hormones out left and right. And your physical body has to deal with that. And so that's where brain architecture can get disrupted. Because if it can't find the settled parts of development, then it's not going to go to the next step and the next step. So when you're working with even older teenagers and they've had early development without any sort of intervention or buffering from, say, stable, nurturing adults, they can get stuck there, and it can get pretty tricky until we get to that next page. So it's a cumulative toll that happens. It isn't like, oh, this happened once, so then you get this. It's cumulative, and it affects us across the lifespan. All right, I'm going to scurry on through these next slides. But this is a really cool one. We talk about gene expression and how toxic stress can change how our genes express themselves. And so we used to kind of think, and we're told, well, you get what you get. You got your DNA, right? Mama, papa, whatever, get what you get. But what we're learning more and more through a science of epigenetics, which is the study and changes in gene expression without actually changing the genes themselves, is that the epigenome, which is just part of that gene, is like a memory that our genes have of the environments that we live in. So we can think of it like genetic memory. Genes can remember things from outside our bodies and how the things outside our bodies affect the inside of our bodies. And so like how our bodies heal after we scrape. Our genes can remember things like that. So just like we build new memories of events and things that we do, our genes can also form and are continuously forming new memories and affecting how other parts inside of our bodies are working. So it also impacts how our organs function, how our organs continue to develop, and it's just kind of key for everything, and it impacts overall physical and mental health. And the most crucial time for building good genetic memories is in this childhood piece, and that shouldn't surprise you with what we're talking about today. So what I want to give you some real highlights on is that researchers down at Emory University in Atlanta have conducted studies with mice to help them identify the role of toxic stress in gene expression. And what they found is this, that a newborn mouse pup may actually harbor generations worth of information passed down by their ancestors. And this is why. Researchers taught male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossoms by associating these scents with mild shocks to their feet. So they did that, and then 2 weeks later, these mice bred with female mice Their offspring were raised to adulthood with no exposure to the cherry blossom smell at all. So even, excuse me, even with no exposure to the smell, when the offspring were exposed to the smell for the very first time, they suddenly exhibited similar characteristics to their fathers. They became anxious and fearful. And what they also found is that the offspring were born with more cherry blossom detecting neurons in their noses and more brain space devoted to cherry blossom smelling. So then the researchers were like, okay. Let's take this out to a second generation and let's see what happened. And it showed similar results. So then, because they're smart folks, they're like, okay, so the offspring grew up with the papa mice and then, their papa mice. So let's artificially inseminate a female mouse who's never even been around these other mice. And let's see what happens. And what they found is that when they were exposed to the same smell, they were more jumpy than when smelling a neutral odor, even though they had never been exposed before to the cherry blossom. And it was also noted in their grandpups as well. So while mice are a long way from getting to humans, it's great information to help us continue to learn more and more about how genetic memory affects us and how the experiences that we have can influence changes in our gene expression. So let's talk about air traffic control for a few minutes. We mentioned it a little bit back, and what I want you to know is that this really helps us manage our stress. Our Air Traffic Control Center, which is also known as like the executive function and self-regulation, are a key set of capabilities that help us regulate emotions. It helps us focus on multiple streams of information at the same time, to set goals, to make plans, and to make decisions in light of all the available information that we have. It also helps us revise our plans, resist hasty actions, so don't be impulsive, and this begins early in life. So what we're learning through science these days is that this set of skills is a foundational to the ability to learn and therefore to achievement. So when this is out of sorts early in life, kids are going to have a harder and harder time building these as they go through and try to be, quote, ready for school. So toxic stress can significantly derail this air traffic control system. And so kids who experience toxic stress have less capability to manage their stressors. So here are some executive functioning skills: inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and kind of these all come together as what we talk about as air traffic control. Here's just a graph for you that kind of gives you some different touch points along the way and development around those three air traffic control pieces and how old we would be, or at what age we would expect to see different steps in a working memory or an inhibitory control or in cognitive function. And I won't read all those to you, but you can kind of see the different strategies there, because what we're learning is that children really aren't mini adults. We can't just expect that they're going to know everything that we know. The healthy development of this air traffic control system really is what helps children manage stressors. And we want you to take away here is two things: that stressors impact lifelong health and development because they're cumulative over time. And it matters when they happen. Stress can happen all over the timeline, but we remember that it's cumulative. They do not happen in isolation, and it matters when it happens. That's why you might see siblings go through the same stressor and react completely differently. So those are just key pieces to take away. All right, now this is a video that's phenomenal because it's about 4 minutes and it summarizes everything up that we just talked about in not 4 minutes. All right. All right, love that video. And the cool thing is that is available to you. If I get everything going, that is available to you on the TCCY page, as you may have just seen there. So just know you're welcome to share that as well. I think it's telling me funny things. Okay. All right. So the next thing we want to jump into, since we've talked about brain development, early brain development, the important factors, 3 of the 4 core concepts of development, which are brain architecture, serve and return, and toxic stress, the next part we want to step into is really around one of the seminal studies that brought us to this point that we're at today. And it's what we call the ACEs study. And it was done back in the mid to late 90s, done in the mid 90s, published in the later 90s, out in California at a health system called Kaiser Permanente. It was a partnership between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. And the researchers from those really wanted to understand common denominators for a lot of the health risk behaviors that they were seeing. They kind of hypothesized and guessed that childhood adversity might be the root cause of some of the diseases that they were looking at. So the cool thing is that they gave out more than 17,000 surveys. And the other cool thing is that they gave them out in their well-being clinic. So you might just be going in for your routine physical. And so it wasn't like they gave them to people who were in the hospital and significantly sick. These were people who were just coming in for like a well visit type thing. They got over 17,000, which if you're not that into research, that's totally cool, but that's a lot of people. And what they found, or well, what their population that they interviewed or surveyed looked like was what you see here. 75% of the people who responded had at least some college. Almost 75% were white, and almost 85% were above the age of 40. So these were middle-aged, middle-class white folks. And the other thing to note is that they were insured, because in order to be able to go to Kaiser Permanente's health system, you had to be part of their plan, and it wasn't a Medicaid type plan. So mostly white, middle-aged, college-educated, insured people who most likely didn't face many of life's challenges that are there today, like poverty or racism. So that's kind of the big picture, and you can dive way deeper into this study if you would like. But they asked around 10 questions, but they looked at 10 different factors: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And you can see there they asked about physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They asked about physical and emotional neglect. And then they asked about household dysfunction. Did you live with somebody, and these were all before the age of 18. Did you live with somebody who had a mental illness, or did you have an incarcerated relative or someone who struggled with substance abuse? Or did you have a mother who was treated violently? They didn't ask about fathers. This was back in the 90s, remember? Or were you in a household that had divorced? And so at the end, participants were assigned a score of like 0 to 10. And then another cool part, if you're into the research piece, is that they were able to compare their scores with that person's medical record. Because remember, they were in a health system. So they had access, and the person had given them approval to access their medical records. So not only could they look at these answers and go, oh, wow, a lot of our population, as you see here, the percentages, 19.4% reported that they lived in a household with a parent or caregiver who had a mental illness. Not only could they just say that number, but they could also look at the health outcomes of these folks. That's really cool stuff, in case you weren't sure. So in every category except incarceration, at least 10% of the population experienced the adversity. And I don't know if your brain is going to where like my brain goes, is this is not the population that you would expect to have such a high rate of adversity. And that was one of the like, wow, kind of pieces of this whole thing. So when we look at ACEs experience before the age of 18 in this study, what you see is that 64% of the respondents had at least one ACE, and 22% reported 3 or more. That's almost a quarter of respondents had 3 or more. And then going forward, when you look at the number of ACEs, As your ACE score increases, so does your risk for health risk behaviors, disease, social problems, and mental health issues, because ACEs have been found to have what we call a graded dose response relationship with over 40 negative outcomes to date. So what that means is that as the number of ACEs increases, so does the intensity of the response, or the likelihood that you experience poor outcomes, or that you experience poor outcomes. So what you see in this information on the left and the chart on the right is some of the negative outcomes associated with an increased ACE score. So you can think about that like a cholesterol score for childhood trauma. The ACE study found that the higher someone's ACE score, the more types of childhood adversity a person experienced, the higher his or her risk was for chronic disease, mental illness, violence, being a victim of violence, as well as all these other things that you see, like decreased graduation rates, lost time from work, alcoholism. Other things that they found, just to give you some examples, was that people with an ACE score of 4 are twice as likely to be smokers and 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic. Having an ACE score of 4 increases the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis by nearly 400% and suicide by 1,200%. An ACE score of 6 or above was associated with a 3,000% increase in attempted suicide. So that kind of shows you what we just said, is that dose-graded response. Compared to people with an ACE score of 0, if you had 4 adverse childhood experiences, you doubled your risk of being diagnosed with cancer. People with an ACE score of 5 or higher are 7 to 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs, to report addiction, and to inject illegal drugs. Just some of the things that they were able to identify in this study. So it's fascinating. There's so much information out there that you can learn, but this is really the heart of where our work has come from. And I think now there's more than 100 studies shooting off of this adverse childhood experiences. And one of the cool things Jen will talk to you about is what we call expanded ACEs. So it's really just powerful information. And I think that's it for me.
Wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and take maybe a 5-minute break. So that'll bring us back right at about 2:15, and we will pick up with this video.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Okay, let me get back to where we were. All right. So grateful to be able to chat with you all about adverse childhood experiences and really build on the information that Melissa presented in the first half of this presentation. So if you all are at all familiar with adverse childhood experiences, you have likely seen this pyramid, which is really an iconic image associated with the adverse childhood experiences study. It's what the primary investigators put together to help people understand the relationship between ACEs and these diseases, disabilities, and social problems that we see later on in life. So what you see at the very bottom there are ACEs, and we know based on what Melissa shared with us that often leads to disrupted neurodevelopment, particularly if children do not have access to safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments that buffer the impact of ACEs. Going up the pyramid, you see that when we have disrupted neurodevelopment, it increases our chances for social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And so it makes sense that when we are struggling socially, emotionally, and cognitively, that we are more stressed out than the average kid. And in addition to that, we have adverse experiences themselves. And so because we're so stressed, we're looking to do what all humans do, which is to escape that stress or to numb out that stress. Because many of these children have not had healthy coping mechanisms modeled for them, they end up adopting health risk behaviors. So that might look like smoking or substance abuse or overeating, right? And we know, and the reason we tell people not to do these things is because it leads to disease, disability, social problems. So if you start smoking every single day at 11, it's going to increase your chances for lung cancer, right? And so all of the adoption of health risk behaviors that we saw among very stressed out children led to the development of these issues later on. Probably one of the most impactful statistics of the ACE study was around early death. So what they found was that when you had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you tended to die 5 to 10 years younger on average than other people with a low ACE score or an ACE score of 0. And a subsequent study done by the National Institutes of Health found that when your ACE score is 6 or more, you tend to die 20 years younger, which is incredible, right, to think about somebody dying at 60 versus 80. So some additional analysis has showed us that even though we have the adoption of health risk behaviors here to help us make sense of a lot of these poor health outcomes, we now know that even if somebody does not adopt a health risk behavior like smoking or overeating or substance abuse, that they're still more likely to struggle with stress-related poor health outcomes like heart disease, for example. And that's because of the mechanisms that have been at play as your brain and body are developing, right? That there is a wear and tear on these different systems because of the chronic stress that you dealt with. So a lot of times adding or adopting health risk behaviors only adds insult to injury. What you see going up the left side of the pyramid, that yellow arrow is epigenetic mechanisms. So as Melissa said, this is an emerging field, but we are beginning to see how adversity can be passed down from one generation to the next through genetic expression, right? And then going down the right side of the pyramid, that blue arrow, you see intergenerational transmission of trauma. And that happens in 2 ways. One, as we learn more about epigenetic mechanisms, we see that indeed these adversities may be passed down to the next generation. But also we know that high ACE parents tend to raise high ACE children, right? So because you are coping with your own stress and trauma, you often expose children to the same patterns and relational experiences and traumas of having a parent with mental health issues or substance abuse issues. The good news is that we know we can break intergenerational transmission of trauma. One of my favorite colleagues often talks about having high ACE parents raise low ACE kids. And we know that when we support parents to meet their basic needs and to heal from their past trauma and adopt positive parenting skills, and it's not just even parents, right? It's teachers, it's any adult or caregiver who engages with children. When we help them heal from their trauma, they are able to have that safe, stable, nurturing relationship essential for raising healthy individuals who are flourishing and thriving. Moving to the next slide, Melissa mentioned that I'd be talking about the expanded ACEs. So you can imagine that in the last 20 years, this research has continued to evolve and develop. And I bet some of you, when you were looking at those original 10 ACEs, thought to yourselves, there are other types of adversity that children experience that I suspect would create toxic stress for them, right? And so we know from decades of other literature that there are other stressors that generate toxic stress. So our friends in Philadelphia really wanted to look at some of these other types of adverse events to see if they had the same impact on health and well-being, to see if they sort of had the same graded dose response as the original 10 ACEs. They were also particularly interested in studying these expanded ACEs because, as you'll recall, the original study with 17,000 people from Kaiser Permanente, all of those individuals were privately insured, and most of them reported being white and having some college education. And so when we think about the community of Philadelphia, that is a more socially, racially, and economically diverse population than the population originally studied by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. So they added these expanded ACEs, including witnessing violence, living in unsafe neighborhoods, experiencing racism, living in foster care, and experiencing bullying. You'll note that the original conventional ACEs dropped out divorce because what they found is that divorce was no longer a relevant ACE for this population. But all of these expanded ACEs carried the same weight as those original 10 or 9 ACEs in this instance. And a huge majority of the folks in Philadelphia at the population level had experienced one or more of these expanded ACEs. And, you know, in the current state of affairs that we're all dealing with, this is incredibly relevant for us to think deeply about as we consider supporting all Tennessee children. So we're going to watch this video really quickly about implicit bias. Okay, so, you know, it's fascinating when we begin to think about expanded ACEs. This video really helps us think about the experiences and the stressors that children of color face compared to white children, right, and the additional barriers that they have. So we know that unaddressed continual stress related to these additional ACEs is more prevalent with communities that experience this adversity, and this leads to increased toxic stress in communities of color. Implicit bias, as he describes, is one source of discrimination and subsequent stress. The Ohio State University Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity defines implicit bias as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. And that video really helped us understand how implicit bias impacts a child's experience as early as pre-K, right? And so we all have biases, but that doesn't mean that they don't negatively affect groups of people that we interact with. And so a lot of the work that we do to address implicit bias is to become more conscious of our bias and not be afraid that we have it, right? Because everybody all over the world has their own biases, but it is incumbent on us to understand what they are and really question them and really rewire our own brains as adults to think differently about groups of people. So even though the video explains that both white and people of color have implicit biases, people of color are disproportionately negatively affected by implicit biases of the majority population. And again, we see as early as preschool, Black children are being disciplined more frequently than white children, despite no difference in actual behavior. While implicit bias certainly contributes to increased stress in children of color, it's not the only cause of identity-based discrimination. So we know, if we move to this next slide, that there are some additional layers that we really have to consider when we think about these expanded ACEs and when we think about the experience of large groups of people in our country. Because our collective well-being depends on creating a foundation of health for all children, it's important to recognize these other elements that compromise healthy child development by producing toxic stress. We know where a person lives has a crucial impact on the foundation of their lifelong health. 70 to 90% of disease risks are attributed to environment instead of genes, right? So depending on where you live, your zip code, your block, your community, we see radical health disparities as a result of the stressful environment you may be living in, or the literal toxic environment in terms of toxins or pollution that you may be exposed to. Many children are born into systems and structures that limit their opportunities to access safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. These environments already have social and economic inequities. We can think about these inequities as being a series of locked doors for children of color. Some children and families have all the keys they need to access healthcare, safe parks, high-quality early education, and stable housing. Many children, including disproportionately children of color, do not have the keys to these locked doors. Census data show that the poorest census tracts are also, one, the richest in proportion of young children, two, have the least realized social, physical, and educational, as well as economic capital, and three, are highly racially segregated and separated from many sources of economic opportunity. The implications are that our country's poorest neighborhoods require substantially more support or keys to unlock doors for young children, but they currently have fewer. This includes individual services to young children and their families, but also publicly available services and voluntary support such as parks, playgrounds, and libraries. Increased family stress associated with a lack of resources, safety, and stability increases risk for exposure to toxic levels of stress in children. Elevated caregiver stress and instability makes it more challenging to have the psychological and financial capacity to engage in nurturing, serve, and return interactions with children. As we compare the pyramid on the right to that on the left, we see there are two additional layers underneath the lived experience of trauma. The foundation of the pyramid is historical trauma, and this foundation impacts a child's health in several ways. Many of the inequities we continue to see today are a result of structures that continue to exist generations later, including segregation we see for communities of color and barriers and locked doors to resources. Additionally, the science of epigenetics is beginning to demonstrate that exposure to trauma by previous generations can be passed down to future generations. Next, kind of going up that pyramid, the blue line you see is the geographic or place-based inequities for social conditions and local context. As we see in the census data, the tracts with higher poverty have a much higher representation of children of color. These areas not only increase exposure to toxic stress because of compromised safety and lack of stability, but also locked doors that prevent access to those services, supports, and community environments that really are going to affect the health and well-being and would offload stressors and promote health and resilience. As an example, the majority of young children of color who live in these low-income areas have working parents. Unfortunately, people of color are more likely to be employed in low-wage jobs that lack predictable schedules and benefits, such as paid time off. Lack of affordability and accessibility locks the door to high-quality early childhood education and care for these families. The result is a stressful, unpredictable, and unstable situation for many families. As a result of chronic exposure to stress and lack of access to support, children of color are more likely to experience ACEs like having a parent with mental health issues or experiencing neglect. This stress certainly impacts the quality and availability of serve and return interactions. And these conditions paint a picture of complex trauma that negatively impact brain and body development. Increasingly, we see children cope with this stress by adopting those unhealthy behaviors that increase the prevalence of disease, disability, criminalization, social problems, and eventual early death. And one thing I really appreciate about the graphic on the right is that instead of saying adoption of health risk behaviors, it names it for what it is. It's coping, right? You're coping with this stress. Also, I do want to point out that below that it talks about allostatic load, which is just a fancy term for your ability to deal with stress. So over time, we have a certain amount of allostatic load or stress load that we can maintain, but you can think about it being like a rubber band. It's flexible, and over time, if you're constantly experiencing this pull from all of these stressors, it's going to wear out that rubber band and eventually it's going to break, right? We can only take so much. And so we know that children who are experiencing these ongoing stressors have an increased allostatic load. They're dealing with more stressors, and over time it wears down, it breaks down, and they resort to unhealthy coping. So we see, again, the burden of disease, distress, criminalization, and stigmatization. And again, I like that word burden because we do see that people of color have this burden, that they didn't ask for, that it's systemic, it's structural in nature, as well as interpersonal in nature. And so across the lifespan, the impact of overt racism and implicit bias continue to contribute to chronic high elevations of stress. These data suggest that improving child health trajectories and reducing health disparities according to race and socioeconomic status is going to require a concerted individual effort as well as community building efforts directed to poor and usually racially segregated neighborhoods and communities. As a community, we can build a strong foundation for children of color who are overrepresented in poor outcomes by identifying those keys to unlock those doors to health and well-being. And so a lot of times we like to think about it as an and both, right? That just like you saw in the implicit bias video, there are specific locked doors and challenges and stressors for people of color because of implicit bias and overt racism, but also over time, policies and practices that have led to disenfranchisement and disparity have also created community conditions that create stress and offer locked doors, right? And I tell people all the time, what we want for all children is what we want for our own children. We want our own children to go to a safe, supportive school, to have safe drinking water, to have nutritious foods, to have green space to play in, right? Because we know as caregivers that these things really support health and flourishing across the lifespan. So we need to look at data, especially disaggregated data, that helps us see which children are not getting those opportunities so that we can create and provide those keys so that they can access things like health care and supportive, healthy, safe communities. And that way they can reach their full potential and will not deal with this burden that we see that exists today. What you see here in this next graph is that the higher the number of risk factors you have as a child significantly impacts or contributes to cognitive delays. So as you see, by the time you get to 6 and 7 risk factors in early childhood, you have between 80 and 100% chance of not meeting developmental milestones, which is incredible and really speaks to the importance of that early development and the impact that adversity has. So we have to think about how do we mitigate those experiences in the earliest years of life, and part of that has to do with scaling up services and supports and resources to parents and communities who are caring for children in that prenatal to 3-year time period. Another thing I often get asked about adverse childhood experiences is, okay, I get that it's bad for the people who experience it at an individual level, but I have an ACE score of 0, and my family doesn't have high ACE scores. How does this impact me? What the data show is that ACEs impact everyone, even if your score is 0, right? Because it contributes to community conditions and disease that affect all of us. What you see in this graphic is you see lots of little pie pieces, and there are about 10 of them. And these are 10 outcomes of adverse childhood experiences. As Melissa shared before, there are more than 40 negative outcomes associated with a higher ACE score. But here we're just showing 10. In the middle of the circle, you see what kind of looks like an oil spill. And that is the amount of the oil spill that is in each of those pie pieces is the amount of that issue that is attributable to a high ACE score. So, for example, there are some people who receive a cancer diagnosis who have an ACE score of 0 or 1. But we know that when we look at the population level and we look at the relationship between ACEs and cancer diagnosis, that 24.3% is attributable to an ACE score of 4 or more. Some areas are even higher. So in cardiovascular disease, we see 25%, high risk for HIV, 59%, anxiety, 56%. So if you can imagine cleaning up this oil spill, the way that you do that is you don't take a paper towel and sort of rub it around. You're just going to spread the oil around. What you do is you take a paper towel or a cloth and you put it in the middle of the oil spill and you let the oil soak up. What this image shows us is that if we, as a community, as a state, prevented ACEs or early mitigated them, that we would have a simultaneous and relative reduction in every single one of these problem areas, plus 30 more. So when we take it back to how does that affect you, for example, it's clear that the rates of these diseases and mental health problems are going to contribute to increased cost for insurance, health insurance. It costs us tax dollars. And it affects our quality of life, right? Because we live in community together, and the way in which the community is either healthy or sick affects every single one of us. So in order to support community prosperity and support even our own individual prosperity, it's imperative that we really think about strategically how we prevent those ACEs from happening in the first place, or when they do happen, how we can wrap services and supports around children, families, and caregivers so that they can buffer the experiences of that stress. Sometimes in our office, we say to people, it doesn't matter if you're running a 5K for heart disease prevention or diabetes prevention, or you just care about the safety of yourself and your family. Every single one of us has a vested interest in addressing ACEs, no matter what it is that we care deeply about. These are 10 more poor outcomes associated with ACEs that some people find even more relevant. So you see here serious and persistent mental illness. ACEs account for 69% of that. Intimate partner violence, 52%. Using painkillers to get high, we have an opioid epidemic in this state, 54%. Think about the billions of dollars and billions of hours that we spend on just one of these issues as a society. And what we're saying is that we could cut it in half in some cases or more, as well as cut in half a lot of these other issues. Tennessee is not unlike other states, or even unlike the original population studied by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. So in the last 2 decades, you've had many communities and states look at the rates of ACEs among their population. The CDC actually has a little set of questions that gets at many of the ACEs that states can opt into adding to their behavioral risk factor surveillance survey. This survey is what lets us know all kinds of health indicators and behaviors at a population level in various states. And so at this point, over 35 states have added on the ACE questions to really see what the relationship is between ACEs and disease. So you can see in 2017, we conducted this survey, and we saw that 61% of the population had at least one ACE, and 28% had 3 or more. So 1 in 4 people in our state has an ACE score of 3 or more. And we know that that's underreported because many people, when they're getting a call, that's the way in which this is conducted, is through telephone call, either landline or cell phone, that they're not going to feel comfortable telling a stranger that they experienced child sexual abuse, for example. Or maybe they don't even recognize that they experienced child neglect. And so these really high rates that we see, we know are conservative and an underreport. What you do see in our state is that this has a profound impact on a lot of our health outcomes and behavior outcomes. So an analysis done by the Sycamore Institute, which is a bipartisan, basically think tank here in Tennessee that really informs us and does research on different policy issues and health issues throughout the state, they found that here in Tennessee, as of between 2014 and 2017, that almost 50% of depression is attributable to that ACE score of 4 or more. 32% of smoking, 24% of asthma, 21% of COPD, 13% of obesity, 13% of cardiovascular disease, 10% of diabetes, and 5% of hypertension. And this is only looking at 8 outcomes. And so when they did this analysis, they really started to look at what's the impact on the economy for Tennessee as it relates to these medical conditions and also time out of work that are attributable to these medical conditions. And what they found is that on an annual basis, adverse childhood experiences cost our state $5.2 billion. And we know that it's a lot more than that because we're not even looking at things like incarceration or crime or necessarily substance abuse, or even things like mental health issues and those kinds of things beyond depression. So $5.2 billion is a lot of money that we could be saving as a state every year. And also, we know that the cost of ACEs to us is considerably more than that. As you heard me describe the methods of the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey that states use to really collect data about health and behavior, you might have thought to yourself, well, what about those people that don't have access to a phone? Those could be individuals who are homeless or people who are incarcerated, right? And we know that those folks are living the outcomes in many instances of childhood trauma and adversity. And so the Family Center, which is a nonprofit who serves Middle Tennessee, has been looking since 2014 at the ACE scores of folks who are incarcerated and who are in substance abuse treatment facilities, over the last 5 years. And what they found is that 74% of these individuals have an ACE score of 4 or more. 50% of these individuals have an ACE score of 6 or more. So should we have reached those folks through our methods, that would probably bump up, or it would bump up, the rates of ACEs that we see in our state because we're not capturing the data of these folks who have had extensive trauma histories. Even when you look specifically at prevention programs that are targeting individuals with just one risk factor, like evidence-based home visiting, as an example, who are working with expecting parents or new parents who have one vulnerability or risk factor, we still see increased prevalence of ACEs. So we collect this data throughout the state, and we see that 26% of people enrolled in one of these evidence-based home visiting programs have an ACE score of 4 or more. That's double the rate of the Kaiser population. And 12% have an ACE score of 6 or more. We've talked a lot about some challenging things that we struggle with as a state, as a country. And some of you may be thinking, wow, this seems overwhelming. So we're about to pivot to the what to do part and the resilience part of our presentation. I want to say that the original ACE study and all of the subsequent studies that we've seen are looking at population level outcomes. So if you have an ACE score of 6 or more, or you know somebody with an ACE score of 6 or more, please do not leave this presentation thinking to yourself, I'm going to die 20 years younger. That is not the message we want you to take away. We are looking at averages and trends when we are observing the population level. But when you get down to an individual level, a person-by-person level, there's incredible variation. So we know that some children are more susceptible to toxic stress than other children. And we describe the children that are more sensitive to toxic stress as being our orchid children, and those that are less susceptible to toxic stress as being our dandelion children. If you've ever tried to grow an orchid and keep it blooming, which is an important thriving and flourishing, so to speak, you know that it requires a certain set of conditions, ideal conditions, in order to bloom and thrive. It has to be watered in a certain way. It needs to have a certain amount of sunlight. The temperature has to be in a specific range. And when that flower blooms, it is beautiful, right? A dandelion, some people consider it to be a weed, right? Because it can thrive in a range of conditions, in a range of heat conditions or temperature conditions, water, light, all kinds of stuff. I mean, you see dandelions that are coming up through concrete sometimes in your driveway. And you know then that these flowers, these weeds, these plants don't require the same set of very specific conditions in order to thrive, and to flourish. If you are a sibling, or if you have more than one child, or if you even know a sibling set of children, then what you have often observed is that even though these children have the same two parents and maybe were raised in the exact same environment in many respects, that they have very different temperaments. So I jokingly say that my sister is more of your orchid child, right? She's more sensitive. And as we were growing up, our parents could look at her the wrong way, and she would be so distraught. I was more of your dandelion child, and I didn't really care how you looked at me. And so I had to have some additional consequences other than a raised tone of voice or a firm tone of voice or a look that was disapproving. My sweet child is the exact same way, not the same way as me, but the same way as my sister, where if I even say her full name, she can sometimes start to cry if I say first, middle, and last name. And so, not one is not better than the other, right? It's just that change or that response to a stressful stimulus. In fact, what we talk about with our orchid children, our more sensitive children, is that they have a wider range of flourishing. So they're very, very affected by suboptimal conditions, but they really thrive and they are really beautiful in those optimal conditions, right? They're among the most beautiful, successful children. Versus you think about the kids like me, those dandelion kids, that we have a shorter range, right? So though we're not as affected by suboptimal circumstances, we're also not as affected by optimal circumstances. So we're not maybe flourishing or succeeding at the same rate as those orchid kids who had those A+ conditions from their caretakers. Another thing that we know that really changes outcomes on an individual level is that adults other than parents and caregivers can play a buffering caring role. So we've often heard from folks who have overcome significant adversity that they had one teacher, or they had a coach, or they had a neighbor, or maybe they went to their grandmother's house every single day. And one or more of these adults was incredibly nurturing to them and buffered them against the stress that they may have experienced with other caregivers in a different environment. Kids can be amazingly resilient when they have consistent access to an adult who provides that safe, stable, nurturing relationship or environment. There are many kids with ACE scores, and adults even, with ACE scores of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, who are not struggling with heart disease or with mental health issues because they had the presence of that adult who supported them. The third thing that you see here is that there is opportunity to repair across development from early childhood through adulthood. So that's good news. We wouldn't have all the therapy and interventions that we do if they didn't work. Obviously, as Melissa talked about earlier, the younger we can employ those interventions, the better, because of the plasticity of the brain. And if we can employ them during adolescence, we're going to see incredible results. But even if we're working with people who are 50, 60, 70 years old, we're still going to see health and healing emerge. It just may take more time and effort. The body and brain want to heal from adversity and from trauma. So when we provide those evidence-based interventions, we will see that healing and health occur and emerge. And so, we do really want to emphasize that interventions matter. And another thing that we like to emphasize is when we have interventions with adults later in life, that is often benefiting the next generation because many of these adults themselves are caregivers. So when we create health in them and relational healing, we are breaking that cycle, that intergenerational cycle of adversity for the next generation. We also already know what we need to promote resilience and thriving. And those are establishing those safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, opportunities to grow and learn early in life. We have the keys to healthy development. So we need that early support for social, emotional, and cognitive and language development, those serve and return interactions. We need those supportive relationships with caregivers and opportunities to learn. And when we notice that there's a little bit of an issue or a developmental delay early on, we need those early interventions for children and their families experiencing adversity or experiencing challenges so that we can go in and remedy them and support ongoing development. Finally, we know that there are opportunities to build executive functioning across childhood and adolescence, and building that air traffic control really helps us cope in a healthier way with stress that comes our way in the future. All right, we're going to watch this video about fostering resilience. Okay, so that video really helps us turn our corner in understanding what it is that we can do to address adversity, to address trauma, and to build resilience in children. When we think about things related to resilience in our society, they are often not aligned with what the science shows us resilience actually is. And so You will hear things like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or if you are thrown off the horse 7 times, get back on 8. And what our friends, some of our researchers and colleagues like to say is the ACE study shows us that what doesn't kill you may actually kill you 20 years younger, right? And so we have to help people understand that environment profoundly affects a child's ability to build resilience. What you see is a metaphor of like a teeter-totter or a scale used to describe the dynamic process of resilience building. So when you think about a teeter-totter or a scale, you think about the amount of weight that you put on one side or the other, tipping it toward one side or the other. So it makes sense that loading a child's scale with those positive outcomes and decreasing exposure to negative outcomes is going to tip the scale towards positive social, emotional, mental health, physical health, and later in life. But what you saw from the video is that the scale has another feature to it, which is, get it to go forward, there we go, the fulcrum. We say in our office that we hadn't even remembered the word fulcrum, and that it jogged our memories from 8th grade math or geometry. But yes, the scale's tipping point, or the fulcrum, really affects the way in which the scale tips. So as the video showed us, that fulcrum starts in different places for different children. If you think about a child who is born with a more sensitive temperament or difficult temperament, then that fulcrum is placed in a point where it's easier to tip toward negative outcomes. Meaning, if you had equal weight on either side, because of the position of the fulcrum, it's easier for it to tip toward negative outcomes. This could be true of a child who was born a little too early, who is premature, or a child who has feeding issues, or a young child who has to have many surgeries, and those kinds of things, right? Those experiences maybe have that fulcrum in a space that makes it easier to tip toward negative outcomes. And our dandelion children have their fulcrums placed in a space where it's easier to tip toward positive outcomes. What the video showed us is that the tipping point is our biology. It is our temperament. It is our brain development. It is the way in which our systems, including our nervous system, operate. And what we've learned all up until this point is that environments and relationships affect all of the things I just mentioned. So especially during those times of plasticity, early brain development and adolescence, we can actually shift the fulcrum or a person's biological ability to be more resilient toward the positive. I mentioned before that I have an orchid child, and my sweet child had difficulty feeding and sleeping and all of those things. And because I was supported primarily, it didn't matter how much I knew, the people that supported me in my neighborhood and at work were the folks that helped me stay regulated and engage in that demanding, challenging game, a serve and return interaction, even though I was sleep deprived, and even though there were these additional difficulties going on. And my knowledge did also help with that, right? It was a combination of the two. And so over time, because I was able to provide, I had the bandwidth and the privilege to provide those safe, stable nurture, or that safe, stable nurturing relationship with my child, I was able to see my child's fulcrum move toward the positive, so that now as a 6-year-old, my child is much less likely to become very dysregulated and upset at something small, and has built in some of those coping skills, developmentally appropriate. I'm not saying that we don't still have some crying jags and some behaviors that are not ideal, but more often than not, my child is able to regulate and pick a good coping skill because of the way in which we were able to support that fulcrum to move toward a direction that makes it easier to tip towards positive outcomes. So we know that over time, the cumulative impact of positive life experiences and coping skills, those air traffic control skills that are building from infancy all the way to our mid-20s, help shift the fulcrum's position, making it easier to achieve positive outcomes. So as you saw from the video, when we tip that scale towards the positive, it's almost like that ball that rolls and pushes the fulcrum over. The more positive experiences we provide, the more we're able to shift a person's biological predisposition toward resilience. So it's and both. One other thing we like to emphasize about a scale, and the reason that this is such an important visual and metaphor for us when we think about resilience, is later in life, we, at least to our, in our current scientific understanding, we are unable to shift the fulcrum. So we do have adults whose fulcrums are in disadvantaged places that makes it very easy to tip toward negative outcomes and to become dysregulated and not experience resilience. And yet, the scale can still tip towards positive outcomes. What it's going to require is a lot more time and effort, as we've said, many more weights that get added to the positive side of the scale so that we do tip that scale toward positive outcomes, even though the conditions are not ideal for tipping in that way. So we can always improve health, wellness, and resilience, no matter where we are in terms of our life trajectory. As we saw before in the implicit bias video and in the expanded ACEs, communities of color disproportionately experience systemic barriers to building resilience. So because those safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments are the key thing to tip our scales toward positive outcomes, if we have decreased access to high quality, affordable childcare, or safe parks, or teachers who are supported in a school that's well funded, or access to a pediatrician or dental care. Those things act as additional systemic and structural barriers and add to the negative weight and the stressful experiences that are on the negative side of the scale and lead to those negative outcomes. And that's just the systemic stuff. There's also the interpersonal stuff that creates a toxic or a stress response, like ongoing implicit bias and overt racism, right? So these additional stressors really add weight to the negative side of the scale. Again, this is not about all people, like at the individual level, not experiencing resilience. But when you look at the data, what we see is from birth to death in every single category of health, wealth, and well-being, that people of color fare worse because of these additional systemic barriers. So when we think about addressing adverse childhood experiences and trauma and toxic stress, we know, one, that ACEs happen across our state in every community, no matter your economic or socioeconomic or racial background, right? That ACEs are common among all of us. And also, we have to have this additional lens that some communities experience more adversity and more stress, and that if we want every child to reach their full potential and thrive, we have to take that and both approach, where we both alleviate ACEs at the population level and also look at those specific communities that have those additional barriers and provide keys to those locked doors so we can eliminate those barriers to health and well-being. Another thing you've heard Melissa and I say probably 40 times at this point are the words safe, stable, nurturing. And those are the things that every child has to have in their relationships and in their environments in order to not just survive, but to thrive. So when we say safe, we mean free from physical and emotional harm, stable meaning familiar routines, people, and places, and nurturing means sensitively caring for and encouraging development. Another thing that we do to build resilience, and we mentioned this when we were looking at the resilience scale, is by building those air traffic control skills. And they are skills that we can build. The good news is even if we miss those periods of development where we would optimally develop that good air traffic control, we can build these skills in adulthood. But we need somebody to come alongside us and help us practice and help us develop those neural connections that help us cope better. So things like focusing attention, problem solving, planning ahead, regulating behavior, controlling impulses, and adjusting to new circumstances. What is this going to require from us as a community in order to really tackle this issue of adverse childhood experiences and move from marginal results or outcomes to massive outcomes that improve the health and well-being for all of us? It will take collective ingenuity. And we are doing this today in Tennessee through Building Strong Brains with people just like you on the webinar who are applying this knowledge to their area of expertise or to their parenting or their neighborhood or their church and improving outcomes for all children. So a big way in which we have to move forward in addressing ACEs is to employ the public health approach. You can remember that a public health approach has been used in lots of things. In fact, we're experiencing one right now with wearing masks. We're hearing all the time about how we need to be wearing masks to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But another one you might relate to that we can kind of follow the trajectory of is smoking cessation. So 50 years ago, 40 years ago even, we had a culture of smoking. And we learned in the early 60s that smoking led to disease. So over time, what that led to was a lot of public health campaigns, public awareness campaigns that educated every single person on the impact of smoking. Now, when you go out and you see somebody smoking, if you say to them, "Did you know that can give you cancer?" They're not going to say, "Really?" Right? Like, they know, we all know. And you can go out and talk to somebody and say, "What are 2 diseases associated with smoking?" And they can't tell you. Everybody knows the dangers of smoking, which has empowered a lot of change. We also saw at this primary prevention level policy change as a result of that awareness. So now you see that there are taxes, increased taxes on cigarettes. You see that you're not allowed to smoke in the building anymore, right? It's not Mad Men where you can smoke in your office and smoke in the movie theater. In fact, we had a progression where we moved to a smoking room, and then we realized that we're sharing this ventilation system with everybody in the building. Now you have to smoke outside. So now you go to many buildings, and they won't let you smoke on the premises. So these policy shifts, both at the federal level, the local level, and at the business level, as well as raising awareness that engage all kinds of sectors like the media and schools and other groups that were not always involved in health issues, resulted in a norms change. And that was what predominantly moved us from a culture of smoking to a culture where smoking is deemed bad, right, and unhealthy. When we think about secondary prevention services and tertiary prevention services, secondary would be reaching those individuals who are at risk of smoking in the first place. Tertiary is treating somebody who already smokes. If you thought about us only employing tertiary prevention, which is to reach those folks who have already started smoking, you would imagine that we would not be able to reach every single one of those people. We would not be able to Chantix our way out of a smoking culture. It had to include that primary prevention. Yet, with ACEs, even though ACEs result in a greater range of poor health outcomes, and also, while we're talking about smoking, increase your likelihood to ever smoke in the first place, you don't walk out and talk to somebody who's not in our field who knows about adverse childhood experiences and who could tell you 2 diseases associated with it. Right now, where we primarily put our time, energy, and money is in that treatment service. And the CDC tells us we will never have enough money to treat out of the ACEs epidemic, that we just don't have the resources to do individual or even group treatment for everyone that's affected. What I say is that it's important for us to have treatment services. We do not need to cut those back. In fact, we do need to expand them. But also a huge piece of our approach has to be primary prevention and public awareness so that when people know better, they do better, and policy change. When we're thinking about employing a trauma-informed approach in our organization and community, we want to use everything that we've learned from this presentation, from this science, to realize, A, the widespread impact of trauma and understand paths for recovery. 2, to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. There's a little meme that goes around that says often the most unlovable children or the most unlovable people are the most hurt people and those that require the most love, right? And so when we redefine the behaviors that we're seeing as not bad but hurt, we can respond, number 3, respond differently by integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices, and then 4th, actively resist that re-traumatization. So often in schools, we see that when teachers or administrators don't understand or even don't intuit, we have a lot of administrators who intuit a lot of this trauma-informed information before they've ever heard of it, right? But when they don't do that, they re-traumatize children all the time by yelling at them, getting in their face, isolating them, right? And all of those things are often triggers of additional stressors or traumatic experiences or adverse experiences that have happened previously and are instigating that alarm clock, as Melissa said, or that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So we're in that state again, even though we're not in immediate real danger, but we do it over and over and over again to kids, and it does not help them learn the skills to regulate. It only keeps them in a state of stress response and not in their thinking brain, right? Not in their rational brain, but more in their reactive emotional brain. In creating our trauma-informed organizations or communities, we have to have safety, trustworthy, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, and an eye toward history, gender, and culture, and the way in which this is affected the lived experiences of people that we live, work, and play with. Another thing that we have to do is we have to invest early. If there's one key theme that we have is that the brain and body always want to heal, that it is easier and more cost-effective to get at it in the first place. And any person who does treatment with abused and neglected children or adults who experience trauma will tell you they wish that it hadn't happened in the first place. And childhood trauma and abuse and neglect is preventable. When we support parents and caregivers and adults early on to develop those skills and overcome their own trauma, we are really breaking that intergenerational cycle, and we're having a lasting impact. That doesn't mean that we don't want to invest in strategies later on. As you see here, Nobel laureate, prize-winning economist James Heckman shows us that we have a significant return on investment, a greater return on investment when we invest in those prenatal and 0 to 5 programs. We still have a return on investment later on, but it's not as great because of the additional time and effort and resources required to help rewire the brain and promote healing. However, when we do a lot of our 2-generational approaches or our work, and we are tackling both the outcomes and well-being of young children and the outcomes and well-being of the caregivers in their lives, we're receiving almost a double benefit. And so we have to think about that intergenerational model of really supporting the whole family. These are some programs. I'm running late on time, but you can just see that these are specific programs with those returns on investment that show, as much as $6.60 return on your investment, which is much better than you can per dollar, which is much better than you can do in the stock market. One other thing that we as communities really have to do to create those healthy and safe, stable, nurturing environments for kids is to create those charging stations, to notice those communities that have spotty charging stations where kids can plug in, power up, and contribute to ongoing learning and health, right? You can think about kids' brains as being like a computer or a cell phone that we've got to charge it up every once in a while so that it can function optimally. So things like church groups, like safe parks and museums and libraries and after-school activities are all places where kids can plug in, charge up, and develop well. We don't have time to watch this video, so I'm going to very quickly say that another key component of what we have to do, and we've sort of said this several times in the presentation, is that we have to get in early. When we notice a little wobble, a little behavioral issue, or that the children are not meeting developmental milestones, when we get in early with that infant mental health work where we support healthy attachment with the caregiver and the child, or we get in early with speech therapy or occupational therapy, we can take that little wobble, like you can think about a wobbling table, and stick a little sugar packet under it and help level that table out and help it function well across the lifespan. If we don't fix the little wobble earlier, the little wobble becomes a bigger wobble later on. Okay, so tables can't level themselves. Children can't, level themselves and promote their own mental well-being and mental levelness. We, as sometimes professionals even, have to be the ones that go in and support the levelness of that child, and the earlier we do it, the better. There are lots of ways in which we can build executive functioning that promotes resilience throughout childhood and adolescence, whether it be engaging kids in sports and physical activity, or journaling and self-talk, or even mindfulness activities. My sweet child, that's one way in which we help that those big emotions is to engage in a mindfulness activity like creating a homemade glitter jar where we shake it up and watch the glitter fall to the bottom. And those are all activities that help build all of that executive functioning. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. Different children are going to be interested in different things, so we want to have lots of opportunities. I want to say that one that says computer games, that does not mean stick a child in the basement for 4 hours to play Fortnite. What we mean are those games that would be more strategic in nature and a little bit short-limited, and maybe even engage an adult in helping learn strategy. A game like Uno, right, helps build executive functioning, or Monopoly or Candyland. All of these are ways that we can support that development. Using that 2 and 3 generation approach is a key way in which we present and early mitigate ACEs. So when we are working with parents, caregivers, teachers, and everybody else who cares for children and helping them heal from their trauma or get the things that they need in order to be stable, and we're working with the child, we see remarkable success. Our Department of Human Services has invested in that considerably over the last 5 years. As we end, I really want to focus on this pair of ACEs to help us really contextualize again what this is going to take. So at the top of the graphic where you see the tree, you see adverse childhood experiences. We've talked about what those are. But what we haven't fully fleshed out are adverse community environments and how those environments contribute to and perpetuate the existence of adversity. So things like poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity and economic mobility and social capital, things like poor housing. All of these environmental conditions contribute to an increase in ACEs in children and teens. And so if we want to prevent these things, it's not just about getting services for mental illness. It's about addressing the soil or supporting the roots in order to create health later in life. So what that looks like is that our approach has to be, again, both and, that it is both services and supports immediately, but it's also addressing those adverse community environments and making them right? Ensuring that every child has a safe house, ensuring that every parent can afford to put their child in safe and stable housing. Even things like storm water management or lead prevention, addressing those literal toxins in the environment or pollution in the environment that's going to affect a child's outcomes and well-being. So these are things we have to consider when we are thinking about really getting to the root cause of adverse childhood experiences. I am at time. I'm actually over time. So I will briefly say there are lots of ways in which we can tackle this. Whether it's changes in the way we develop our communities or changes in business policies and investment. I mentioned infant mental health earlier. I feel like it's important to take a moment to clarify what that is. That is supports that provide optimal social and emotional development and relational health for children. So it's not, children, not infants on a couch doing psychotherapy. It really is about relationship building. And a lot of those supports that we know work, like home visiting and adopting trauma-informed school practices. It's also those things that address ACEs, like intimate partner violence or access to substance abuse and mental health treatment. But lastly, it is about creating stability for caregivers. When we, for instance, provide sufficient income support for low-income families, the research shows us that rates of abuse and neglect significantly go down, which reiterates a lesson I've learned working in child abuse prevention, is that parents don't intend to hurt their children or give them ACEs, right? Parents are doing the best they can with what they have. And when parents have less stress on their plates and more resources, they know what to do and they have more bandwidth and capacity to engage in those nurturing relationships. If you've ever been around a child and you've been stressed, you know what it's like to snap or to raise your voice or to do something you wish you hadn't done, right? It's always important to apologize when you do that because all of us will inevitably do it if we're around a child long enough. But the more stress you're under, the more those experiences are going to happen. So when we give families enough money to pay the light bill and put food on the table and to get by and have the basics, they parent well or even parent good enough, and we don't see a lot of these outcomes. Much of what we do with Building Strong Brains Tennessee is to change the philosophy and approach that people take, to change policies or support the change of policies and funding, to be more strategic and aligned with the science, to support the expansion of programs and services or the enhancement of programs and services that prevent and mitigate ACEs, and also to really change our professional practice when we're working with adults and families and children in our community. And just like we saw with other public health campaigns, it takes every single sector that you see represented around these 4 Ps, as we affectionately call it, to change these outcomes and to promote health and create the culture change we really need to see. At the end of the day, as you're really thinking about what is it I can do, what can I adopt, how do I, maybe bring in bring in the 4 Rs of resisting re-traumatization and recognizing how prevalent it is. How can I change the way that I live, work, play, worship, right, based on the science? One thing that you can do right away is change your perspective from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. So when you're seeing a person who's demonstrating dysregulated or angry or troubling behavior, instead of saying, what is wrong with that person, right? you can take a step back and say, I wonder what's happened to this person. And it changes your entire posture, your entire stance, the way in which you think, the approaches, your body language, everything, and often de-escalates the situation. This is also true when we're thinking about groups of people. So we struggle, again, I said it earlier, with opioid epidemic in our state, among other substances. And when we start to think, I wonder what's happened to this huge group of people that they are looking to cope with substances, then that really helps us get to the root cause of why they ever abused substances in the first place, and helps us actually change substance abuse rates. When we think what's wrong with you, we don't go to those helpful policies and strategies that get to the root cause, and we don't see meaningful change. So with that, please go visit our website at tn.gov/TCCY, and then you can find our section on ACEs to learn more. And also, we ask that you fill out the survey to let us know how we did. I know we went a little bit over. I'm bad about that. I'm too passionate about this stuff. But we really want to know what you liked, what you thought could be better explained, et cetera, so that we can constantly improve this material for you. So with that, I'll end.
Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation today. I always really enjoy listening to you, and I always learn something, so thank you very much. Wanted to ask if you and Melissa would be able to stay for just a few moments afterwards to answer any questions. And we welcome, if you can stay, if you have any questions, we will continue on the line. But on behalf of all of the regional coordinators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and engaging in this meaningful presentation. All recordings are available on our TCCY website. That's tn.gov/TCCY. Under the publication tabs, you click on the videos. As a reminder, if you are calling in today and need a CEU certificate or a certificate of participation, please email Susan Cope at tn.gov, your name and request for either a CEU or participation certificate. All attendees will be receiving an email next week with certificates and membership information about joining our local councils. And again, we thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us today. And if you're able to stay on for some questions, we welcome you to stay. So thank you very much.
I think I'm able to say, I'm sure. Or Melissa, are you able to? Good deal. We're a good team, she and I, so we'll be happy to tag team.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Melissa. Actually, we do not have any questions. We have a lot of compliments to you all for the presentation, and very useful information and beyond the bare basic. So is what one comment was. So
I have a couple questions that popped up to me independently, and Melissa may have that too. Melissa, do you have some questions that came to you privately?
I don't see any that came privately to me.
Okay. Well, I'll read the ones that I got aloud, and then Melissa, if you will contribute to answering them, I would greatly appreciate it. Okay. So the first thing that I see, there was a question I think that has been answered about the oil spill slide. So that one has been answered. The next one, Melissa, you put in the questions, the original ACE question. Perfect. Okay. So the next one that I see is,
Jen?
Yeah.
If you want to touch on, someone just asked if these presentations could be used in schools, and if you want to expand on that.
Absolutely. So our Department of Education is fabulous and have taken this presentation and added to it to have trauma. So it's like this part one, and then there's a part two that's trauma-informed practices and policies in schools. Actually, I think that Melissa's a trainer. Not that she has time to train everybody, but didn't want to indicate that. But there is that out there, and also we have done this training in schools across the state, the Part 1. It is incredibly useful. So we have a group of 1,152 lovely individuals who can present this exact slide deck. So if you're interested in having one of them present at one of your schools, just reach out to me at jen.croft, JENN.CROFT @tn.gov, and I'll try to put that in the chat in a second. So let's see. Another question I see is, do you have assessments or questionnaires that we could use to screen parents and make referrals? Excellent question. And I will really lean on Melissa here too. She is a clinician. But what we very broadly say is that there's a way in which you can do this that's trauma-informed, but your whole organization needs to do a lot of exploratory work. We don't recommend that people just give out ACE questionnaires and make referrals. A lot of times the behaviors will tell you what you need to know. And there's many inappropriate ways that can either trigger or compromise somebody's private information. And also get folks into some potential legal trouble because we're all mandated reporters. So we do not recommend that people just administer the ACE questionnaire and make referrals. We recommend that people really look at behaviors, get to know kids or families, and ask them even what it is that they feel like they need, because a lot of times when you make a referral, if the family doesn't identify that as a need, they will not follow through on the referral. So if you're interested in learning more about using an ACE questionnaire, we would recommend that you go to either, it's the NEAR Science Toolkit. It's NEAR, all capital letters. And if you look up NEAR Science Toolkit Washington, it will bring that toolkit up and make it available. Perhaps we can also send it out in the email that will come next week. That talks really about the organizational readiness that needs to be in place before you do that. Melissa, as an expert on all things clinical and ACEs, will you add to that?
Sorry, I was trying to double task. I just put that Near at Home website in the chat. I think everybody can see. No, you did great. I just echo what Jen said. We just want to be very aware of when and how we are distributing that ACEs questionnaire. It's great information to have, but there's always a time and a place to be able to do that effectively. And the sensitivity, sorry, I was a little bit distracted. The sensitivity of the information, just because it's there doesn't mean that everybody in the school or in the building or in the church needs to know what it said. And that's hard for some people, but just the general broad conversation of this child or this family has some adversity going on can help shape the movement forward.
Awesome. The next question I have is, do you have a parenting program that's used to help address that primary prevention? Yeah. So we at the Commission do not do any direct services. We primarily focus on changing systems and collaborating and doing advocacy work at a broad level. But there are many, many, many parenting programs throughout the state, evidence-based parenting programs that ideally would supplement other things going on, because that's typically, in the secondary prevention, but a lot of times what we need to see at the primary prevention level is policies that support working parents and access to services and health care and those kinds of things. So I used to work for an organization that primarily did evidence-based parenting education. And what I would say is that it was really only or mostly successful when we were coupling it with meeting other concrete or mental health needs. So just consider that to be and both, but organizations like Nurture the Next, like the Family Center, like the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services RIP program, all of those are excellent resources for parent education. Okay, I have a couple Q&A too. Let's see. Sorry, y'all. I'm trying to navigate this. Okay. All right. So a lot of these are technical issue stuff. Okay. Okay, good deal. I think that there's no more questions on my end, so that should be good. Oh, where to find more information about introducing this and talking with parents about ACEs in a sensitive way. I'd recommend going to the youth, oh gosh, what is the Nadine Burke-Harris shop?
Center for Youth Wellness.
Yes, thank you, the Center for Youth Wellness. If you look up Center for Youth Wellness San Diego, they have some guides with that, but also that neuroscience toolkit that Melissa put in the chat is an excellent resource for learning about how to talk to parents sensitively about this. Okay, I think that's everything.
Yes, and if there are other questions, they'll be receiving an email, so they'll have a contact to email us back if there are other questions that they think of later. So, Melissa, Jan, thank you all.
Thank
Susan,
you.
Dana, and Christy, thank you all. I hope everyone has a good afternoon.
Yeah, thanks to the 148 of you who stuck around. All right, bye, everybody.
Thank you all.